The UN says that without fresh targets on the progress we've made until now, we certainly aren't going to limit the rise in global surface temperature to 1.5. In fact, they're talking this week of a forecast of 2.7 degrees. You're going to need to get some new measures out of the next 2 weeks to hit the 1.5 target that you've talked about.
Well, Trevor, this is obviously a very big, tough ask that we've got here in Glasgow, but I think it's worth reflecting on where we've got to. So before Paris, analysts suggested that we were heading towards 6 degrees of global warming. After Paris, that temperature curve was bent downwards under 4 degrees. And actually, if you look at the UN report that you're referring to, and of course the International Energy Agency report, that suggests that if you take all the commitments that have been made by governments, we have bent the curve towards 2 degrees. So there has been progress for the last few years, but I would say that actually the task we have here is in many ways tougher than Paris. Paris was a brilliant achievement, a historic achievement, but it was a framework agreement. What we've had to do since then is to agree some of the detailed rules, and some of the most difficult rules are still outstanding after 6 years. That makes it really challenging, and of course we know that the geopolitics is more difficult than it was at the time of Paris.
Well, let's come to some of that, but you say that we've made progress. Actually, looking at what countries have done, I think we reckon that of the 35 most important countries, only the Gambia has hit its Paris Accord agreement. Are you going to start by essentially laying down the law to the parties here that basically they haven't done what they said they would do in Paris?
Well, Trevor, you're right. I mean, this is on world leaders at the end of the day. And they made the commitments in Paris that we would limit temperature rises to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts to 1.5. And now in Glasgow, they have to deliver. We've got the G20 ongoing right now, and those world leaders will arrive here tomorrow for the World Leaders Summit. And my message to them is very clear. Leave the ghosts of the past behind you. It is Halloween today, after all, but leave the ghosts of the past behind you, and let's focus on the future and unite around this one issue that we know matters for all of us, which is protecting our precious planet.
Your colleague, the Prime Minister, is not very optimistic. He said to the UN a month ago, when Kermit the Frog sang "It's Not Easy Being Green," I want you to know he was wrong. I invite you in November to celebrate what I hope will be a coming of age and to blow out the candles of a world on fire. Classic Johnson boosterism. This week, he said it's going to be very, very tough, this summit, and I'm very worried because it might go wrong. It's touch and go. It's very, very difficult. It's very far from clear that we'll get the progress that we need. What happened in the weeks in between those two statements?
Well, look, the Prime Minister's absolutely right. It is going to be really, really tough at this summit, and we've got 2 weeks to get this over the line. But he was also making the point that when we took on the presidency of COP26, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now at over 80%. Almost all the G20 nations that we're talking about have got a net zero target for the middle of the century. If I had come onto this programme a year ago, Trevor, and I'd said that to you, you would have been really sceptical. So there has been progress, but there's much more to do.
But we're talking promises here, aren't we? And actually, part of what you've got to do in the next couple of weeks is arm wrestle people into some new promises. Now, it's not that helpful that President Xi, President Putin aren't turning up. I mean, basically, they're saying, honestly, we're not that bothered.
Well, if you have a look at what both President Putin and President Xi have actually announced, they both announced net zero targets for the middle of the century.
More promises. More promises. They haven't met the first lot yet.
Well, if I may, and of course, the World Leaders Summit is really important. We've got over 120 world leaders coming from all over the globe. But of course, what we're also going to have is 2 weeks of detailed negotiations, and those teams are here. I've met with some of the representatives from Russia, from China over the last few days as I've been doing the sort of pre-prep for COP itself. And so that is what's going to be really important, is to get over the line these key negotiating issues as well. And this is a chance, quite frankly, for all of these countries to show leadership. This is the point where they have to stand up and be counted.
Do you want more out of China and Russia than they have promised?
I want more out of every country. But I think the point here is that we have made progress, and then we're going to have to take stock of where there is a gap in what the commitments are and where we need to be. And one of the things we're going to have to discuss in a very consensus-led way is how do we close that gap over this decisive decade? And, some people are suggesting we need to come back and look at those commitments again, those 2030 commitments over the next couple of years. That is an agreement that's going to come through consensus, and it's my job to help build that consensus.
What are you going to do about the Saudis and the Australians, both of whom are basically saying, fine, we'll try and do what we can, we'll plant some trees and so on, but we are absolutely not going to reduce production of oil, in Saudi's case, and Australia's case, before 2030. And that is going to stymie your aim, isn't it?
Well, both those countries have committed to net zero by the middle of the century. And of course, the pressure is on them, as it is on every country, to set out precisely how they will do that. And that's why we have been asking for countries to set out their long-term strategies for getting to net zero. The UK, as you know, in the last few days, has published its own net zero strategy, which has been welcomed by very many. It's seen as a benchmark, a global benchmark, which others can look at as well. So, my ask is of every country, come forward with the detailed policies which will deliver on the commitments that you've made.
You mentioned the UK. The Chancellor this week reduced airport duty taxes. He's made flying domestically easier. Has he apologised yet for undermining your credibility?
Well, actually, if you look at what the Chancellor has announced, he's announced very many billions of pounds of support to further our plan for a green industrial revolution.
Yeah, but he's made it easier to fly from London to Glasgow.
Let me address that issue. So domestic aviation represents less than 1% of our emissions in 2019. And remember, as a country, over the last 30 years, we've cut our emissions by over 40%. And you need to see this alongside the fact that we are investing in sustainable aviation fuels. We've got a Jet Zero program. And of course, there is an issue of connectivity where, because we are an island, you can't get that easily from one part to the other, which isn't the case for every country.
Are we going to come out of here in 2 weeks with a deal of some kind?
That is what I'm driving towards, and I think what I've always said is that what we need to come from out of Glasgow is to be able to say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 alive. And I know you've got others on this programme, and that 1.5 really matters. We know from the IPCC that we're already at global warming of 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels. At 1.5, there are countries in the world that will be underwater, and that's why we need to get an agreement here on how we tackle climate change over the next decade.